I've read a lot of stories here, and I guess it's finally time to share my own. I'm Michael, and to be straight up, I've always been different. I've got Asperger's, which has made me see things pretty black and white. People tell me I'm blunt, but I don't really have that filter most folks seem to have. It's not like I'm trying to be rude, I just don't always see the point of all the extra fluff people add to what they say. Growing up, it was rough. Kids can be pretty unforgiving. I was the quiet one who loved numbers, order, and routine. While other kids were out doing their thing, I'd be in the library or working on my little computer projects. Of course, this made me a target. I got called all kinds of names, and people would act like I was some kind of alien. Even adults didn't always get me. Teachers would say I was unusual, like I wasn't standing right there. But here's the thing, being different has its perks. I'm good at seeing through lies. Maybe it's because I can't stand people being fake, or maybe it's because I pay attention to stuff others miss. My world is a lot simpler than what most people make it. If you're honest, great. If you're not, then I don't have time for you. That's just how I work. One day, I found myself in a situation that I never expected. I was at a gas station, just filling up, when I saw two guys hassling a girl who looked around my age. It didn't sit right with me, so I just walked over and told them to leave her alone. I'm not some hero, I just couldn't stand there and watch that happen. I didn't realize they'd turn on me. One guy swung at me, and it all happened fast. But I've trained in self-defense for years, mostly because I know I don't read people's body language well. I guess that day, it paid off because I managed to hold my ground until the police came. What I didn't expect was that I'd end up in custody, sitting in a cell like I was the criminal. I just kept thinking, what kind of world do we live in where I'm the one behind bars? I didn't have anyone to call, my family isn't around much, and friends? Let's just say I have a few good acquaintances. I was preparing myself for the worst, thinking I'd have a record for doing the right thing. But then, something unexpected happened. A judge got involved and for some reason, he wanted to meet me. I'll never forget what he said. He looked me over, asked a few questions, and then said, "Michael, I've read your record. You're a man of strong principles. I believe we need more people who stand up like you did." And just like that, he dismissed the case. It was like he saw right through me, and for once, I didn't feel like I was the odd one out. That judge releasing me was a wake-up call. All my life, people had either ignored or ridiculed me, but here was this authority figure telling me that I'd done something right. Walking out of that station, I felt proud for the first time in a long time. It didn't change how people looked at me, but it changed how I looked at myself. Maybe being the weird guy wasn't such a bad thing after all. I threw myself into work after that. I've always been great with numbers and patterns, and I landed a solid job in data analysis. It's perfect for me because it's logical, numbers don't lie, and there's no room for pretending. I'd work late, stay in my routine, and honestly, I didn't think much about meeting someone. Relationships were a whole other challenge. I'd tried dating here and there, but it usually ended with the woman telling me I was too blunt or that I didn't understand her emotions. Then, I met Dawn. Dawn was, well, she was passionate. About everything. She had this fire about her, like every cause or issue she stood for was the most important thing in the world. We met at a work event, one I wouldn't usually attend, but my boss had insisted. I remember watching her from across the room, the way she spoke with this intensity that drew people in. And before I knew it, we were talking. She found my honesty refreshing, she said. I figured, why not? She was interesting, and for the first time, I thought maybe someone actually saw me, not just the quirks. We started dating, and for a while, things were good. She liked that I didn't play games and that I always told her exactly what I thought. She said it was a relief compared to the guys who were all talk and no substance. I'll admit, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was beautiful, smart, and had this wild energy that was so different from my own. For once, I didn't feel like I had to hide parts of myself. We got married a year later, and life seemed to settle into a routine that worked for both of us. She'd go off to her protests or meetings, and I'd stick to my job, making sure our bills were paid and everything ran smoothly at home. But as time went on, her fire started to burn through everything. Dawn became more and more extreme with her activism. I'm all for people standing up for what they believe in, but she started prioritizing it over us. Over our home, over me. I'd come home to find she hadn't cleaned up after herself, or that she'd forgotten to pay a bill because she was so focused on some rally. We started fighting about it more and more, with her accusing me of not supporting her, and me feeling like she was letting our life together fall apart. It all came to a head one night when she came home late, way past midnight, and told me she'd be gone the whole next weekend for some protest across the state. It was supposed to be a family weekend we'd planned months back. I reminded her, but she just shrugged and said, "This is more important, Michael. It's bigger than us." That was the moment I started to realize that maybe we didn't want the same things. After that weekend, things started to unravel fast. Dawn threw herself even deeper into her activism, and it was like she was drifting further from me every day. I'd get home from work, and she'd be on her laptop organizing events, calling people, or even planning to fly out somewhere. It was almost like I didn't exist in her world anymore. I tried talking to her about it, about how I felt left behind, like I was just some background character in her life. I told her that while I respected what she was doing, I felt like our marriage was falling apart. She just brushed it off, saying I was being selfish. "You don't understand," she'd say. "There's so much at stake here, Michael. This is my purpose." I couldn't help but feel a bit bitter. I had my own purpose too, to make a stable life for us, to have a home and maybe even a family someday. But those things didn't seem to matter to her. Every time we talked about it, she'd just give me this look, like I was holding her back. One night, she stayed out late again, and I was up waiting for her, which wasn't something I usually did. She walked in around 2 a.m., and I asked where she'd been. Dawn looked at me, her eyes a bit glazed over, and laughed. "Why do you care?" she asked, almost mocking me. "You're always saying I'm too busy for you." Well, I found people who get me. That was a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to say, so I just went to bed, feeling more alone than ever, even though my wife was right in the next room. The next morning, I tried to clear the air. I told her I wanted us to spend more time together, just us, without all the chaos. She barely looked up from her phone and muttered, "Maybe if you actually supported me, you wouldn't feel this way." Then she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. It was like I was talking to a stranger. But the worst came later. One evening when she was out at a meeting, I got a message from a friend of mine who'd seen her at a bar with another guy. I didn't want to believe it, but something in my gut told me this wasn't just some casual outing. I waited up that night, and when she came home, I confronted her. "Who's the guy?" I asked directly. She looked stunned for a second, but then her face hardened. "What are you talking about, Michael? Don't play games with me. People saw you." She just rolled her eyes and laughed. "Oh, come on, Michael. Not everything is a conspiracy. Why are you so paranoid?" she said, her tone dismissive. But there was something in her eyes, something that told me she wasn't being completely honest. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was my wife, the person I'd trusted with everything, and she was looking at me like I was some fool. For a guy who sees things in black and white, this was my worst nightmare. After that night, things got tense. Dawn avoided me, and I found myself avoiding her too, honestly. The trust one had in her was cracked, and every time I tried to push it aside, I'd get that image in my head of her with another guy, laughing at my expense. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it really was innocent, and I was reading too much into it. Then, about a week later, I got my answer. I came home early from work, hoping maybe we could actually sit down and talk, figure things out. As soon as I walked through the door, I heard Dawn in the kitchen, talking on the phone. She sounded different. Soft, almost playful, in a way I hadn't heard in a long time. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I heard her say, "Yeah, I know. It's just hard to get away sometimes." No, he has no clue. Those words hit me like a brick. I didn't need to hear the rest. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't stand there a second longer. I walked back out and sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, my hands shaking. For the next hour, I sat there, debating with myself. Part of me wanted to go back in and demand the truth, but another part of me just couldn't handle it. I felt like I was losing my mind, questioning everything I thought I knew. Dawn, the woman I'd married, had become someone I didn't recognize, a stranger who apparently didn't mind lying right to my face. Finally, I decided I needed to confront her. I walked back into the house, my heart pounding, and found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and gave me this fake, sweet smile that only made me angrier. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, confused. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. I heard you on the phone, Dawn. Just be honest with me. Who is he? Her face went pale, and for a second, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But instead, she scoffed and crossed her arms. Michael, you're being ridiculous. Are you really that insecure? I couldn't believe it. She was doubling down, lying to my face. I felt this wave of anger and hurt, but I kept it together. Don't insult my intelligence, Dawn. Just tell me the truth. I deserve that much. She stared at me, her jaw clenched, and finally said, fine. If you want to know so badly, yes, I've been seeing someone else. Are you happy now? Hearing her admit it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. I stood there, trying to process the betrayal, trying to understand how the woman I married could do this to me. But then she added, almost offensively, well, maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have had to go looking elsewhere. She said it like she was the victim here, like this was somehow my fault. I didn't say a word. I just walked out, got in my car, and drove. After I left, I drove aimlessly for hours. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The anger, the betrayal, it all sat like a heavy weight in my chest. I ended up parked at some random overlook outside of town, just staring at the city lights, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. It was late by the time I got back. The house was dark, and Dawn was already in bed, or at least pretending to be. I crashed on the couch that night, lying awake, my mind racing. I kept replaying her words. If you weren't so boring, it was like she twisted a knife and just left it there, assuming I'd be too numb to feel it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Dawn bustling around the kitchen like nothing had happened. She didn't look at me when I walked in, and I didn't say a word to her. She acted like she was just waiting for me to let it go, like this was some minor thing I should be able to brush off. I could feel the resentment building, but I wasn't ready to explode. Not yet. Over the next week, things between us were cold, silent. She didn't apologize, didn't even try to explain herself, which just confirmed what I already knew. She didn't feel any remorse. In her mind, she justified everything. I was just the boring husband who was somehow to blame for her cheating. A few days later, I got a call from a buddy of mine, Phil. He'd heard through the grapevine that Dawn was out with the same guy again, a regular at these activist events she'd been attending. It was humiliating, hearing it from someone else, but it wasn't really a surprise anymore. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around pretending everything was okay. I started looking up divorce attorneys, trying to wrap my head around what that would mean for us financially, for the house, for everything. I didn't want this. I'd hoped we could work things out. But it was clear Dawn wasn't interested in fighting for us. She'd already made her choice. That evening, I sat her down. I think we need to end this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You're not happy. I'm not happy. This isn't a marriage anymore. She didn't argue, didn't try to change my mind. Instead, she shrugged and said, fine. If that's what you want. Just like that. It was almost a relief to her. That reaction, it cut deeper than anything else. She wasn't even pretending to care. A few days later, I filed for divorce. Filing for divorce felt like both a relief and a failure. I'd always been the type who believed that marriage was supposed to be for life, that you worked through things together, no matter how hard it got. But with Dawn, it was like we were on two separate islands, and I'd been the only one trying to build a bridge between us. Once she got served the papers, she didn't put up much of a fight. If anything, she seemed more focused on keeping her image intact. She didn't want word getting out that the perfect activist with a devoted husband was now suddenly single. It was strange to see her care more about what people thought than about saving what we'd built. As we started dividing things up, she barely seemed interested in the house, the furniture, or even the memories. She just kept saying, I don't want this to get messy, Michael. Let's handle it maturely. Like that was her main goal, to come out looking mature to the world. It was baffling, watching her treat this like a simple business transaction. Then one evening, a mutual friend of ours called me, warning me about a post Dawn had made on social media. Curious, I logged on and saw it, a long dramatic post about how she had found herself and was leaving behind toxic people who didn't understand her passions. She didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious to anyone who knew us. She painted herself as the victim of a loveless marriage, talking about how she was finally free to be her authentic self. I was furious. I hadn't dragged her name through the mud. I'd kept everything quiet, respectful, hoping we could part ways without making it any uglier than it already was. But here she was, lying publicly, rewriting history to make herself look like a hero. I felt a strong urge to defend myself, to post my side of the story. But I knew that would just drag me down to her level. So instead, I took a step back. I let people believe whatever they wanted, figuring the ones who really knew me would understand. After that post, it was like Dawn's whole persona shifted into overdrive. She was constantly out, constantly posting, acting like she was some kind of celebrity in our small town. She'd show up at every event, every protest, making sure everyone saw her as this passionate, free-spirited woman who had broken free from the chains of a bad marriage. It was honestly hard to watch. Meanwhile, I started working on rebuilding my own life. It wasn't easy. Everything reminded me of her, our house, my routines, even little things like the way I made coffee. But little by little, I started to adjust. I stopped expecting her to come home late, stopped waiting for the sound of her voice in the house. And eventually, it got easier. And then, just as I was starting to find some peace, Dawn's life took a turn I hadn't expected. So, as I was slowly putting my life back together, Dawn started to unravel. Her activism had always been intense, but now it was like she was on some kind of mission to prove herself. She kept pushing harder, getting louder and more aggressive in her public stances. It was all over social media, and every time I saw another one of her posts or heard about her latest cause, it was like watching someone I didn't recognize. Then one day, a mutual friend of ours, Lisa, messaged me out of the blue. She'd been one of Dawn's closest friends when we were together, and we hadn't talked much since the split. I assumed she was reaching out to support Dawn, but her message was something else entirely. "Have you seen what's happening with Dawn?" she asked. I had no idea what she meant, so she sent me a link to a local news article. Apparently, Dawn had made some bold claims about a recent issue in town, accusing several local businesses of unethical practices. She was all over social media, calling out these people by name, rallying folks to protest outside their shops. But her accusations didn't hold up under scrutiny. People started questioning her facts, asking for proof, and when she couldn't provide any, things quickly went south. Within days, her following started to shrink. People unfollowed her, called her out for spreading misinformation. Some even publicly criticized her for trying to ruin local businesses without solid evidence. Watching this happen, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was angry that she'd used our community as her personal stage. But another part of me, deep down, felt relieved maybe? Like finally, people were seeing the side of her I'd dealt with all those years. But it didn't stop there. Dawn doubled down, refusing to apologize or backtrack. She kept insisting she was right, even as more and more people turned on her. Her activism, which had once been a source of admiration, became the very thing isolating her. I watched as she lost friends, lost followers, even lost some of the respect she'd fought so hard to gain. And the more she pushed, the more people pulled away. A few weeks after her public fallout, I bumped into Lisa at a coffee shop. She seemed genuinely concerned, not just for Dawn, but for how this whole mess was affecting me. "I don't know how you did it, Michael," she said, shaking her head. I never realized how intense she could be. I just shrugged. "I guess people show you who they really are when things don't go their way." Lisa nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I felt understood. People were finally seeing what I had seen for years: the stubbornness, the need to always be right, no matter the cost. I didn't take any pleasure in it, but I won't lie, it felt like validation. As Dawn's reputation continued to crumble, I focused on moving forward. And that's when I met Janet. Meeting Janet was like a breath of fresh air. I wasn't looking for anyone, honestly. I was still getting used to being single, to the quiet in my life that had felt so strange at first but was starting to feel peaceful. But one day I was at the bank, dealing with some paperwork for the divorce, and there she was, Janet, the bank teller with the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. She was different from anyone I'd known. There was nothing loud or flashy about her. She had this calm, steady energy that immediately put me at ease. I don't remember exactly how we started talking, but it was natural, easy. She asked me about my day, made small talk, and before I knew it, I was telling her more than I'd planned. I guess something about her just made me feel comfortable. A few days later, I found myself back at the bank, this time for something completely unnecessary, just hoping to see her again. Sure enough, Janet was there, and she smiled that same warm smile when she saw me. This time, she asked me if I'd ever tried the coffee shop down the street, suggesting it as if it were no big deal. I knew what she meant though, and I wasn't about to miss the chance. Our first coffee date was simple, nothing fancy. We just sat, talked about everything from the weather to books, and even joked a bit about how bad the bank's coffee was. She asked me about my work, listened closely when I explained what I did, even though I knew data analysis wasn't the most thrilling topic. And when I asked her about her life, she told me about growing up in the same small town, about her family, and about her love for quiet weekends and home-cooked meals. The thing that struck me most was how genuine she was. Janet didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. She didn't have a grand agenda or some big plan to change the world. She was just herself, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be myself too, without having to impress anyone or prove anything. Over the next few weeks, we met up for more coffee dates. There was no pressure, no drama, just good conversations, a few laughs, and eventually the start of something real. She didn't mind my quirks, my need for routine, or the way I sometimes spoke a bit too directly. In fact, she told me she found my honesty refreshing, saying it was nice to be around someone who didn't hide behind pleasantries. Janet became a light in my life, something I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. And the best part was, it wasn't complicated. It wasn't filled with tension or secrets. It was just two people enjoying each other's company, learning to trust again. One evening, as we walked through the park, she reached for my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. For the first time since the divorce, I felt a quiet happiness that I hadn't felt in years. With Janet, I could see a future, not the kind built on big plans or grand ideals, but one rooted in small moments, shared kindness and genuine connection. As things got more serious with Janet, I started bringing her around some of my friends, and even my mom. I was a little nervous about that last part. My mom is supportive, but she has a way of looking out for me that can feel a bit intense. But Janet handled it like a pro. She was kind, polite, and completely genuine, just like she always was. My mom even pulled me aside afterward and said, "I like her, Michael. She's got a good heart. You don't see that every day." Hearing that from my mom felt like a huge green light. I realized how much Janet had already become part of my life, and how natural it felt to picture her there. We spent more time together, blending our routines little by little. Janet had a daughter, Emma, from her previous marriage, a quiet, thoughtful kid who loved reading as much as I did. At first, I was worried I wouldn't know how to connect with her. I'd never been much of a kid person, and I worried about coming off too stiff or awkward. But one day, Janet invited me over for dinner with Emma, and we hit it off in the simplest way. Emma was reading one of her fantasy novels at the table, and I casually mentioned that I'd read it years ago. Her eyes lit up, and suddenly we were talking about plot twists and character arcs, her excitedly filling in details while I nodded along. It felt easy, like I was talking to an old friend. Janet watched us with this gentle smile, and I knew then that I wanted to be part of this family. As we spent more time together, I got to know Janet's quiet strength. She wasn't the type to complain or make a big fuss, but she always found ways to be there for the people she loved. She'd bring over a home-cooked meal after a long day at work, or she'd text me a simple "thinking of you" when she knew I was stressed. It was in those little moments that I felt truly seen, truly appreciated. Meanwhile, Dawn's life was still unraveling, though I tried not to pay attention. People would bring up her latest antics here and there, or I'd hear something through friends. It was like she was desperately trying to keep her image intact, even though everyone had already seen through it. She seemed to thrive on the drama, on the attention, even if it was negative. One afternoon, I ran into Dawn at the grocery store. She barely looked like herself, hair messy, eyes tired, the spark I'd once seen in her replaced by something bitter. She gave me this half-hearted smile and tried to act like everything was fine, but I could tell she wasn't doing well. She mentioned how her activism had hit a few bumps, blaming it on people who just didn't understand her vision. For the first time, I felt sorry for her. Not angry, not bitter. Just sorry. She was still fighting for something that didn't exist, still trying to be someone she wasn't. It made me realize just how far I'd come, how much I'd moved on. When I got back to Janet's that night, she noticed something on my face, like I'd seen a ghost. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions. Instead, she just put her hand on my arm and said, "Whatever it is, I'm here." And in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. With each passing month, life with Janet felt more like home. We'd fallen into this easy rhythm, weekend hikes with Emma, lazy Sunday breakfasts, and quiet nights watching movies after Emma went to bed. It was simple, but it was everything I'd been missing. I had one moment that really stood out to me. Janet invited me over for dinner one evening, and when I walked in, Emma ran up to me with a drawing she'd made. It was a picture of the three of us, a little stick figure family, all holding hands. She'd drawn me next to Janet, with Emma between us, and in her little scrawled handwriting, she'd labeled it my family. I didn't know what to say. I just looked at Janet, and she had tears in her eyes too. I'd never realized how much that kind of acceptance could mean to me, and here was this little girl who decided I was family. Not long after, Janet and I talked about moving in together. It wasn't a big, dramatic decision. It just felt like the natural next step. She had a little house on the edge of town, with a small yard and a picket fence, the kind of place I'd never pictured myself living in but now couldn't imagine being without. We decided I'd rent out my own place and move in with her and Emma. My friends kept telling me how settled I looked, like I was finally at peace. And honestly, I was. For the first time, I wasn't constantly questioning if I was enough, if I was interesting or exciting enough to keep up. Janet didn't need that from me. She loved me for exactly who I was, quirks and all. One night, as we were sitting on the porch after Emma went to bed, Janet turned to me and said, "You know, Michael, you're the first person who's ever made me feel truly safe." It hit me hard, in the best way. In that moment, I knew I wanted to build a future with her, a real one, rooted in the small but steady joys we shared. We started talking about the idea of marriage, of blending our families completely. Janet's parents were supportive, even thrilled, and my mom, who had been skeptical of Dawn, welcomed Janet with open arms. It was like every part of my life had finally clicked into place, like I'd found the person who understood me in a way I'd never thought possible. The months that followed were filled with little milestones. Janet and Emma joining my mom for Thanksgiving, Emma asking me to help with her science project, Janet giving me a drawer for my things without even making a big deal about it. And as the holidays rolled around, I decided it was time to take that final step. On Christmas Eve, after we'd put Emma to bed, I handed Janet a small, wrapped box. She looked at me, her eyes filled with that soft, steady warmth that had changed my life, and when she opened it to find a ring, she whispered, "Yes." In that quiet moment, with the lights from the tree casting a warm glow, I knew I'd finally found my true home. After Janet said yes, life moved into a new phase. We didn't rush into planning a big wedding. That wasn't our style. Instead, we decided to keep things simple, focusing on building a home that felt solid, comfortable, and ours. We talked about having a small ceremony with just close family and friends in the backyard. Emma was thrilled about the idea, already planning to be our flower girl and drawing up little invitations in her handwriting. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with a quiet excitement. Janet and I would spend evenings after Emma went to bed, talking about our future. For the first time, I felt like I was really on the same page with someone. There were no big dramas, no expectations that I couldn't meet, just two people who wanted a life built on mutual respect and kindness. Then, about a month before the wedding, I got an unexpected call. It was from Dawn. I hadn't heard from her in months, and I wasn't exactly eager to reconnect. But part of me was curious, so I picked up. Her voice sounded tired, strained, and there was a hesitation I wasn't used to hearing from her. "Michael," she started, "I heard you're getting married again." To Janet. I kept my tone neutral, not giving away anything. "Yeah. We're getting married next month." There was silence on the line before she finally spoke again. "I just wanted to say, I'm happy for you. Really. I know things got difficult between us, and I wasn't the best wife. But it seems like you found someone who fits you better." I didn't know how to respond to that. I could tell she was trying, in her own way, to make amends. It was the first time she'd acknowledged any part of the pain she'd put me through. Part of me wanted to unload everything I'd been holding back, to let her know just how much her betrayal had hurt, how hard I'd worked to rebuild my life without her. But instead I just said, "Thanks, Dawn. I hope things are getting better for you too." She gave a small, sad laugh. "Yeah, working on that." There was another pause, and then she added, "You deserve this, Michael." I mean that. I hung up feeling a strange mix of emotions. Closure, relief, maybe a bit of pity for Dawn. It was clear she was still struggling, still trying to find herself in a world that didn't cater to her every whim. But I didn't dwell on it. Instead, I focused on what mattered, my future with Janet and Emma. When I told Janet about the call, she listened quietly, nodding in that understanding way she had. She didn't pry or ask too many questions. She simply took my hand and said, "I'm glad she's letting go, Michael. You deserve to start fresh, with no shadows hanging over us." And with that, we moved forward together, ready to step into our next chapter. As the wedding day approached, I started to realize just how far I'd come since everything fell apart with Dawn. Janet and I were a team in every sense. No big speeches or grand gestures needed. She just got me, in a way I never knew was possible. She didn't make me feel like I had to be more than I was. That feeling was grounding. It reminded me that love could be steady, not just fireworks and drama. The wedding itself was exactly what we wanted. It was a small ceremony in Janet's backyard, with a white arch draped in flowers that her parents had put together. Emma, dressed in a little white dress with a flower crown, took her role as the flower girl very seriously, tossing petals down the makeshift aisle as our closest friends and family watched. My mom cried, of course, and even Janet's dad, a man of few words, looked a bit misty-eyed. When Janet walked toward me, her face soft and calm, I felt something settle in me. It was a quiet but powerful feeling, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. She wore a simple dress, no frills or sparkles, just like her, and when she took my hands, everything else faded away. The vows were short, but they meant everything. She promised to be my quiet place, and I promised to always be honest, to always be there, just as I was. It was probably the first time in my life that I felt no need to explain myself or worry about being misunderstood. She knew me, inside and out, and she loved me for it. After the ceremony, we had a small reception in the yard. Emma danced barefoot in the grass, and my mom and Janet's parents talked like old friends. There was no drama, no tension, just a sense of ease that I'd never experienced before. At one point, as the sun was setting, Janet and I found ourselves alone on the porch, watching the guests laughing and talking. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we just stood there in silence, taking it all in. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what I've always wanted." I squeezed her hand, unable to find words that felt big enough for what I was feeling. Instead, I just held her close, knowing that this was the life I'd been searching for, the peace I hadn't even realized I needed. In that quiet moment, surrounded by people who cared about us, I understood something important. Love didn't have to be complicated. It could be simple, steady, and true. And as I looked at Janet, my wife, I knew I was ready for everything that lay ahead, together as a family. Married life with Janet was even better than I'd imagined. We didn't do anything extravagant or change our routines drastically, but that was the beauty of it. Our life was filled with small, meaningful moments: Sunday morning pancakes, quiet walks with Emma in the park, and evenings spent side by side, just reading or talking about our day. One day, a few months into our marriage, Emma asked if she could start calling me Dad. It took me by surprise. I didn't want to push her, but I'd be lying if I said my heart didn't swell when she asked. I knelt down, looking her in the eyes, and told her, "Only if you want to, kiddo." She grinned and hugged me, and from that day on, I was Dad to her. It was something I'd never expected, but it felt more natural than anything. Life settled into a rhythm that I found I craved. Every day was another reminder that I'd finally found a place where I belonged, a family that felt like mine in every way. Janet and I had even started talking about expanding our family. She asked me one evening, after Emma had gone to bed, if I'd ever thought about having another child. The question caught me off guard, but I realized I'd thought about it more than I'd admitted to myself. "I'd love that," I told her, smiling. "With you? I'd be ready whenever you are." She just nodded, her face lighting up with a mix of excitement and peace, and we spent the rest of the night talking about names, imagining what our future would look like. It was a quiet conversation, without any grand expectations or rush to make things happen. We both knew that whatever came, we'd handle it together. As the weeks passed, our life continued to unfold in the best way. I could tell that Janet felt the same sense of stability and happiness that I did. It was in the way she'd touch my arm as she walked by, or the way she'd lean into me on the couch, just to feel close. Even Emma seemed more relaxed, more at ease, knowing that our home was filled with love and laughter. One day, as we sat down for dinner, Janet suddenly cleared her throat and gave me a look that I couldn't quite read. She seemed almost nervous, which wasn't like her. I raised an eyebrow, wondering what was on her mind. I have some news," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Emma looked at her, eyes wide with curiosity, and I felt my own heart start to race. Janet took a deep breath, then finally said, "We're going to have a baby." The words hung in the air for a second, and then Emma let out a squeal of excitement, jumping up to hug her mom. I just sat there, stunned, until it sank in. Then I laughed, a deep, genuine laugh I hadn't felt in years, and reached over to pull both of them into my arms. We were having a baby. Our family was growing, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely ready for whatever came next. After Janet told me the news, I walked around in a daze of happiness for days. I'd catch myself smiling at the smallest things, a baby onesie in a store window, parents playing with their kids at the park, even the little crayon drawings Emma would make. Everything suddenly felt more significant, like our world was expanding, one tiny piece at a time. We started preparing slowly. Janet was practical, not the type to get caught up in baby fever, so we didn't go overboard. Instead, we took it one day at a time. We turned our guest room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft green that Emma had picked out. She was thrilled to be a big sister, always chattering about all the things she'd teach her new sibling. Watching her excitement was one of the best parts of it all. She'd stand in the middle of the empty nursery, hands on her hips, directing me and Janet on where the crib and rocking chair should go. One night, I found her sitting in the middle of the nursery floor, talking to her little brother or sister about all the games they'd play. She promised to share her favorite toys, to read them stories, and even to let them have her dessert sometimes. Hearing her speak like that, so full of innocence and love, I felt my heart swell with a sense of peace I'd never known. As the months went by, our family life settled into this warm, easy rhythm that felt unbreakable. I'd get home from work, and Janet would be in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepped dinner, Emma by her side, helping by peeling vegetables or setting the table. I'd join them, pressing a kiss to Janet's cheek and asking her how her day went. It was a simple life, but it was full of more love and meaning than I ever could have imagined. Janet's belly started to grow, and with it, my anticipation. I found myself reading books about parenting, something I'd never thought I'd do. I wanted to be prepared, to know everything I could to give this child the best I had to offer. Janet teased me about it, saying, "You're going to be the best prepared dad in town," but I could tell she appreciated it. The closer we got to the due date, the more excited we all became. We'd spend Saturday afternoons lounging in the living room, Janet with her feet up, and Emma curled up next to her, gently resting her hand on Janet's belly. Sometimes the baby would kick, and Emma would squeal with delight, her eyes wide with amazement. She loved feeling connected to her sibling, even before they were born. One evening, about a month before the due date, we were all cozied up on the couch. Emma was dozing off with her head on Janet's lap, and Janet leaned her head on my shoulder, sighing contentedly. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think a lot about what I wanted for my life. I used to think I needed all these big, bold experiences to feel fulfilled. But sitting here with you and Emma and this little one, this is all I need." Her words hit me deeply. I remembered those years when I thought love had to be complicated, dramatic, something you had to fight tooth and nail to hold on to. But here in this small living room, with the people who mattered most, I knew I'd finally found a love that was steady, real, and lasting. We sat there in comfortable silence, just holding each other, and for the first time, I felt like I truly understood what it meant to be at peace. The morning the baby came, everything happened fast. Janet shook me awake just before dawn, a look of both excitement and panic in her eyes. "I think it's time," she whispered, her hand gripping mine. For a second, I froze, but then all those weeks of preparation kicked in. I grabbed the hospital bag we'd packed, called Janet's mom to come watch Emma, and helped Janet into the car, trying to keep calm even though my heart was pounding. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Janet was breathing deeply, and I tried my best to reassure her, though I was probably more nervous than she was. By the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to rise, casting this soft golden glow over everything. I remember thinking how fitting it was, that a new day was breaking, just as our family was about to grow. Hours later, after what felt like both the longest and shortest day of my life, I held our son for the first time. He was tiny, with a full head of dark hair and the softest little hands that curled instinctively around my finger. The nurses fussed around us, but I barely noticed. All I could see was him, this small, perfect person who had just changed my life forever. Janet was exhausted but glowing, her eyes filled with a love so deep it took my breath away. I kissed her forehead, holding her hand as she smiled up at me, tears in her eyes. Emma arrived a few hours later with Janet's mom, bouncing with excitement. She tiptoed into the room, her eyes widening when she saw the baby in my arms. "Is that him?" she whispered, like she was afraid of waking him up. I nodded, carefully handing him to her. Emma held him as gently as if he were made of glass, her face filled with wonder. "Hi, little brother," she whispered, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "I'm your big sister. Don't worry, I'll take care of you." Watching her with him, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. This was my family, and I knew I'd do everything in my power to protect and cherish them. The first few weeks with our new son, whom we named Daniel, were a mix of chaos and magic. Janet and I had our hands full with late-night feedings, diaper changes, and trying to balance our new responsibilities with making sure Emma still felt just as loved and included. She was a proud big sister, always eager to help, and every morning, the first thing she'd ask was, "Can I hold him?" Daniel, for his part, seemed to know he was surrounded by love. He'd look up at us with those big, curious eyes, tiny fingers reaching out, and it was like he was already trying to make sense of this new world he'd entered. At night, I'd sit by his crib after he'd fallen asleep, just watching him breathe. I didn't know it was possible to feel this much for someone so small. The depth of it was overwhelming. One evening, after we finally got Daniel to sleep, Janet and I sat on the porch, sipping tea and just soaking in the quiet. She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder, and let out a long, contented sigh. "Can you believe this?" she whispered. "I mean, everything we've built here?" I nodded, reaching over to take her hand. "Sometimes I still can't," I admitted, thinking back to the long, lonely road I'd taken to get here. "But I wouldn't change a thing. Not one single thing." She smiled, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and pure joy. "You know, I thought I knew what happiness looked like. But this is better than anything I could have imagined." For a while, we just sat there in comfortable silence, looking out at our yard under the soft light of the moon. The sounds of crickets filled the night air, and from inside, I could hear Emma's soft giggles as she told herself a bedtime story, one she'd likely share with Daniel in the morning. There was a fullness to the night, a peace I never thought I'd experience. In those moments, surrounded by the family we'd built together, I knew that I had finally found my true home. Life wasn't perfect, it was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes exhausting. But it was real, and it was mine. And as I sat there holding Janet's hand, listening to our children's soft breaths drifting through the open window, I knew that this was all the wealth I'd ever need. That was the night I stopped looking back.